Greetings. I wanted to go ahead and just summarize a few items that we've been taking a look at the last several weeks, and we will be looking at in the future as well. One of the things, Crime, Justice, and Human Rights, your book here, really I think is helpful from a criminal justice perspective. And there's a lot of human rights books that I've reviewed, and they've come from political science, anthropology, sociology, psychology, social work, and it seemed like criminal justice was really underrepresented in the textbook area. There's a few, but really not many. So I was really pleased that we have this book that's really concise and well organized with a wealth of information. And for example, in chapter 4, the authors talk about collective rights and discrimination and looking at the individual versus the group, really, and then also looked at some specific conventions. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the rights of persons with disabilities. One of the things I wanted to mention, I know that I'm probably focusing more on genocide, torture, massacres, and huge human rights violations leading to death and destruction. And that's, of course, not always the case, that we certainly have a lot of human rights violations that do not involve death and destruction, and those are also very important to analyze as well. Obviously, my bias is probably toward the study of genocide, which is my specialty area, and that results in the bias, spilling over into the classroom, for better or for worse. Although I'm pretty much convinced if you study genocide and torture and massacres, that gives you a lot of insight to all these other human rights violations as well that occur within those scenarios. And then in chapter 5, integrating criminology and human rights, again we see Professor Dembar's work come into discussion in much greater detail, looking at the different types of thinking about human rights: natural, deliberative, protest, and discursive. And one of the things I like to do is to look at this and think to myself, which is the primary type of thinking that I have, and how do I feel about the other types as well? Or do I have a combination? Do I have a dominant mode of thinking and then some secondary ones? Or am I opposed to any of these? And there's no right answer here, obviously, but I think that's kind of helpful. I'm not going to mention which one I prefer, because that's really not relevant. But I would say that take a look at the four of them, and of course you probably could figure out which mode of thought I'm coming out of after you've listened to a few of the videos. But think about that. That's kind of interesting to look at. And then really we get into criminal law and criminal courts. And so I have us looking at chapter 6 and then chapter 9, kind of putting those together because I think they work better as two chapters together in that regard. And so in looking at, for example, criminal law, they talk about the shield and sword binary function of human rights and some of the problems with that and examples. And of course, you see examples that are helpful in thinking about, human trafficking, state crimes, counterterrorism, and human rights violations. And then also we see when we start looking at, for example, the criminal courts, they talk about internal constraints as well as external constraints. And then they also have an excellent discussion on therapeutic jurisprudence and basically problem-solving courts and some of the things that we've been trying in the past and continuing to try to resolve and reduce problems. So also this gets us into the mode of thinking about how do we solve problems. And that's one of the main features, I think, of this course, is to not only understand human rights violations and put them into different perspectives and theories, but also to think about how do we reduce these violations or end these violations. And every Sunday, I wake up and get a cup of high caffeinated coffee and get our Sunday New York Times, and usually there's a couple of articles on the front page of current human rights violations going around somewhere in the world. And then as I read more and more, there might be a dozen or so just in that newspaper that one day that are ongoing and problematic. Even sometimes after teaching a genocide course a year later, still we see these same problems, and sometimes the problems have become worse. Your other book, Human Rights and Wrongs, Slavery, Terror, and Genocide. Oh, by the way, your edition may be just one color, and that's the same book. It's just, this is an older version, and they reprinted it with another company. And so, if you see this book and you're saying, well, that doesn't look like mine, no, it's as long as Human Rights and Wrongs, Slavery, Terror, and Genocide by Dr. Helen Fine, you got the right book. So, I'll point that out in case you see me moving this around here. And really, Chapter 4 and then Chapter 5 kind of go together, although I separated them to allow some time to think about the material and integrate it with the other readings. But Chapter 4 focuses on Chapter 4 is States of Terror in the late 20th century, Algeria and Argentina, focusing on French Algeria and the Algerian War, which basically was around 1954 to 1962, and then Argentina. And the disappearances that occurred there from the military from 1976 maybe to around 1981. And then Chapter 5 moves into the genocide in Guatemala, 1966 to 1996, and also Iraq, 1968 to 2003. And one of the things that I first recognized, always hits me with when I'm studying a lot of these cases, is that I look and realize that I was actually around during the Algerian War, although relatively young, and then also the Argentina disappearances, the Guatemala genocide, the Iraq genocide, and sometimes you can see that there's this history of problems and violations that have occurred over time. And a lot of times, for example, if you were to study Iraq, you could start at 2001 or 2003 and then move forward. But I would always recommend to go back, historically, to look at the Gulf War and look at the prior conflicts and situations, and look at the Iran-Iraq War, and a lot of that is contained in the chapters as well. Basically, and also we see some of those variables that come up as maybe factors that are related to the crimes against humanity, the genocides, the tortures, for example, income, religion, colonization, having certain allies, ethnicity, political rebellions, suppression of opposition. And so we see a lot of different reasons going into the human rights violations. And so there's really a good discussion on Algeria and also Argentina. And then we see in Chapter 5, which we'll look at in a couple weeks, States of Terror turn to genocide, Guatemala and Iraq. And one of the things that I think is really important here is to look at human rights violations as a process, as this dynamic process, not just all of a sudden one day there's no human rights, the next day there are human rights, but to look at this historical process of how these human rights violations form, how the risks are there, and how they increase or decrease. This is of primary importance for intervention. And so in case study 2, and I have you putting together a policy brief, and I posted an example on our web course on the Syrian crisis. And one of the features about all this is that we can trace how these became human rights violations and ethnic cleansings and genocides over time, and look at the different patterns, and also look at what we try to do as far as interventions, or what was attempted as far as interventions. Sometimes you can simply say there were no interventions. For example, Rwanda, for the most part, no interventions by outside nations, a total neglect in that regard. And we see that a lot of times in genocides that and other human rights violations, is that many times the perpetrators believe, and sometimes are accurate, that they will get away with the human rights violations. And so that's another issue that we see in trying to figure out how to prevent or discourage these types of behaviors. So there's really a wealth of information in all that. There's for the case study too, in regards to looking at the whole idea of, let's say, what you select. Feel free to select any human rights violations. So you don't necessarily need to focus your attention on genocide or ethnic cleansing. I have a whole nother course, graduate and 2 undergraduate courses that I run on genocide. So this course is clearly related, but there's a lot of other aspects to human rights violations that hopefully we'll take a look at throughout the semester as well. So there's all kinds of human rights violations, whether it involves elderly, children, disabled, minorities, women, and there's whole lists that you can find of different conventions, treaties, and proposals, and support and lack of support, and then of course looking at human rights violations. And I think also when you take a course like this, you become more sensitive to what's going around in the media and in the world as well, and thinking about diagnosing, assessing different human rights violations. My early career, when I was a young graduate student, I started working in Child Protective Services. And back then, I never thought about human rights. I didn't think about what are the rights of these children that are coming through, the social service system, the legal system, the criminal justice system, or the juveniles that I counseled, or those that were referred by court to our programs. And I think about that differently now, especially when it came to working cases where severance of parental rights was involved. Thinking about all that now, I have a little bit of a different perspective. One of the things that bothers me greatly is that when I was working in Child Protective Services, I had asked and tried to get children treatment as soon as possible, but yet there were often barriers and roadblocks to getting these traumatized children treatment. And now looking back on that, I think I could have made maybe a more articulate argument, a better argument than I did back in the 80s on the responsibility of the state to provide care for these children. And so the reality was, some of these children really either didn't get treatment after they had been abused or neglected, or they got treatment 6 months or a year later. And my goal always was to get all these kids treatment as soon as possible, and allow all of them to get treatment. And I think back then, because of my lack of experience, I just asked and asked and asked, and after a while, you keep asking, or you leave the field and go into something else where maybe you can write about it or research it and think about, are these kids still out there? And, so we still have that problem with runaways, with adolescent trafficking, with adolescent prostitution. We still see violation of human rights of juveniles and children in our own country even. And we have to figure out, what can we do to resolve some of these problems. So there's just a host of features that we can look at, and I always recommend choose a specific case and one that you have a great interest in following. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.